All right, so as we've noted, growing older is not all fun and games. And I think Evelyn mentioned that health issues can emerge. And as a result of those health issues, relatives and friends often become part of the 53 million unpaid caregivers today. And many of those are in what we call the sandwich generation, who are taking care of both children as well as aging parents. Let me reiterate that 53 million unpaid caregivers. A lot of times we use that phrase caregiver, and we're thinking of professionals, people who are paid for their services, but 53 million are unpaid. And so that makes it really personal. It's us, it's somebody that we know. And so we're going to hear from Scott Liu, who's going to share with us about caregiving.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank Crescendo for the opportunity to share and speak a little bit at the Crescendo conference. We're going to be talking today about caregiving and the church, and particularly focusing on care providers and ways that we as a church community, can support people who are in caregiving care situations. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a number of slides here that I hope will facilitate the learning in this conversation. And then partway through the presentation, we'll actually cut away to an interview. And then after the interview, come back, do a little bit more teaching, and then move into a time for discussion and breakouts. So with that, let's jump right into it. I'm going to share my screen here. We are talking about caregivers and the church, and not so much focusing on the care recipients, but really focusing on those people that are providing care in our churches and in our ministry context. And what we're trying to do is trying to build awareness that there are actually a lot of care providers out there. There are a lot of caregivers. And then to consider how we as the church can support those who are already in the role of caregiving. When we first started working on this, we were looking at caregivers that were providing care for aging people. For example, like aging parents, or if you have a spouse, you and your spouse are growing older, and one of the spouses is the primary caregiver. And so we started with that, looking at caregivers for aging, for people who are aging. But as we've had further conversations, something else that has emerged is that there are many people who are caregiving or providing care for a person in their family, maybe who's facing special needs. You might have a child who is autistic, and so you as a parent are a caregiver for them, or you have an adult sibling who maybe has special needs, so you're providing care for them. So we're focusing on the caregiver, recognizing that at times the care recipient might be an aging parent, or it might be a person with special needs. For me personally, I'm engaged with this because my parents are aging. This is our family. Again, my parents are there, and then also my daughter and son are both in college. But the reason I'm showing you this is because my wife and I think others in your ministry context, might be what are considered people in the sandwich generation. That is, people who are caring for aging parents and who are at the same time raising children. And those children might anywhere be between birth through college age. And statistics say that almost 40% of the people who are age 28 to 43 are in this sandwich generation. And in the demographic of the ages of 44 to 59, 44% of the people are caring for aging parents and raising children. You can imagine as well, if your child is also, you have someone in your church whose child is a special needs child, that they are also caring for an aging parent as well as a child with special needs. And so the broad-based piece that we're seeing is that people that are providing care for kids and adults, they experience significant stress and fatigue. And again, this is maybe seen, maybe not seen, right? I'd like to introduce to you someone in our church, and his name is Bun. And we're going to talk a little bit more about caregiving and Bun's particular situation. And so, Bun, first off, could you tell us about your family, your situation, please?
Sure. My wife, Edie, and I have been married for almost 20 years. It'll be 20 years this summer. And when we decided to start a family, we ended up having identical twin boys, Nathan and Gabriel. But at 19 months, or around 17 or 18 months, our pediatrician saw some delays, and we give a lot of credit to him for picking it up. And so at 19 months, both Nathan and Gabriel were given a soft diagnosis for being on the autism spectrum. We just didn't know how severe. And about a year and a half later, we decided to go through the formal diagnosis, which ended up encapsulating, they caught a lot of stuff in addition to being on the autism spectrum. We believe that they have ADHD, dysgraphia, dyslexia, early on some very, very heavy and severe sensory integration concerns. But they are 16 years old now, 16 and a half. So we've been through a lot, and the boys have grown up tremendously. They've made a lot of strides, but certainly there are still some areas of struggle, certainly where some of their special needs and their disabilities sort of pop out. But we're very grateful for them, and we're very proud of them, and we're very thankful that God has them in our lives.
Thank you, Bun. Your boys are certainly amazing, amazing kiddos. So I want to ask you, we're talking about caregiving. And so as a caregiver for your boys, what, how could the church community be supportive for you?
So one thing where people don't realize, I think, where a church could be supportive for a family struggling with this or special needs is really inviting and actively integrating the family into the church community, because we're often feeling very lonely. And then number two, the caregivers, generally the parents, are emotionally exhausted, very tired, but also feeling very, very isolated. So that level, any sort of social integration, there's the spiritual integration where we're allowed to go to church because the boys aren't putting up a fuss. But just having people come alongside with us and actively integrating it almost takes like some sort of emotional burden and load off of us, making us feel like we belong, we're part of something, and we're not alone. And so that is one of the biggest things. Of course, you can dive into details, excuse me, of how integration looks like. But one way for caretakers to feel, or caregivers to not really feel alone, also is inviting them to, in our case, like us, inviting us to social events that the church has, be it a small group, checking in on us to make sure that, hey, are you going to the Christmas Eve service, or will you be going to the Good Friday service? Making sure that we're really a part of something, because by default, caregivers or caretakers are isolated and we're by ourselves often. And so just really including us, and it's kind of interesting, like our church right now is going through a series on belonging and inclusion. That is two really big areas that ensure that caregivers and caretakers don't feel alone, don't feel isolated, and in some extreme cases, don't feel ostracized at all.
Bun, thank you. What you've shared is super key and a really good reminder for all of us, including me as pastor of our church. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing some of your family, sharing some of your heart, and certainly sharing some of your experience and insight.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. Thanks for including me in all this.
We are continuing to learn together. Bun and I are in conversation about what is helpful, what could be supportive, and he's telling me what the boys need and what would be good for their family. So some of the challenges, broadly speaking, could land into a couple of categories, and I'm just calling one emotional and one logistical. In the emotional arena, caregiving is isolating. Oftentimes, the caregiver themselves feels isolated and alone. And then logistically speaking, caregiving is just busy. As a parent, it's busy. You're driving kids to all kinds of stuff, and you're engaged with stuff at school and sports and music. But then also, you've got, if you're caregiving for an older person, you've got medical appointments and shopping and transportation there. This one other statistic about the challenges that come in, according to that AARP report, when you look at what caregivers are providing, 80% of caregivers are providing transportation. Also, caregivers are providing a lot of grocery, shopping, housework, and preparing meals. The reason I'm showing you this kind of slide about some of the logistical stats is because I think it gets at what are some of the possible solutions? What are some of the possible ways the church can engage? So I believe that the church is uniquely situated. The Fellowship of Christians are a uniquely situated community to come alongside and support caregivers. And one of those is to ask the question, where is God? Looking for God's transformative work. Where is the goodness of God at play or at work? We just had a conversation with and a gathering with a number of our special needs families in someone's home. And the opening question was not, what are all the challenges of caregiving for special needs kids? The question was, where do you see God's blessing? Where do you see God's goodness in your family and in your children? And that question, looking at where is God at work? Where is God's goodness? Where is God's provision? Moved the conversation away from challenge and problem solving and moved it into the arena of God's goodness and God's transformative work and God's blessing. The other way that the church is uniquely situated is to walk alongside caregivers, listening and sharing and talking with them, creating spaces. A big message is to share, you are not alone. You are not alone. Encouraging them that caregiving is a hidden ministry. A lot of people don't see it. It's hidden. And then the third thing, which I had just shared about, was listening, creating a space for caregivers to share about what their real experience is. Also, and these are logistical opportunities, ways to care for the caregiver. The church could provide tangible help and support. That was that previous slide. What are caregivers doing? 80% of caregivers are providing transportation. Are there ways that people in your church could help with transportation or grocery shopping? Hairdresser home visits. Someone that goes to the home and cuts someone's hair. We've done that with my parents, helped cut their hair. Running errands, of course, shopping, rotating the tires in the car. You might want to consider older students in your church, if you have them, or maybe adults who aren't working, how they might be able to provide care. Other possibilities for care, and this is on the relational and emotional support. Bun and I talked about this. It's so important to be intentional about inviting and including the caregivers. Yes, also to include the care recipients, but to also be intentional about inviting and including and supporting the caregiver. For us as leaders and in our ministry and in our churches, our verbal affirmation and assurance goes a long way, especially when we might have someone in our church who is, I don't know, maybe just struggling with something or feeling like, I'm not sure if I belong. We as leaders in the church, as pastors and ministry leaders, we can say, I'm glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. You can also, as a church, create and sponsor events classes or gatherings, like the gathering that we had in our church with the special needs families, parents. You can also create spaces for sharing and prayer. I think the church can provide spaces even to grieve, the grieving the loss of relationship, the loss of function, creating these spaces for sharing and prayer. And then here's my plug for Crescendo. Crescendo has a 4-session sort of study on caregiving. And you can get that with the Crescendo app, or talk to any of the Crescendo people, and they'd be happy to point you in that direction. The last picture I want to share with you before heading off to discussion groups is this is a picture of my parents, their birthday photo. And then this is a picture of my parents over 60 years ago. And one of the great spaces for my parents to talk about is, for my dad, so my mom's not speaking anymore, but to talk about with my dad is the arena of reminiscing. His long-term memory is really strong and intact. And so sometimes we'll just go through some old pictures and talk about things. Right now it's May, the month of May. And if you have high school students or youth, you know that this is prom season, the season of formals in high school. And in the month of May, I found out that my dad, many years ago, took my mom to the senior prom. So it's just a fun thing, looking for God's goodness, engaging in the stories, recognizing that my mom and dad have this huge and beautiful history. And what they're experiencing now, it's intense, it's hard at times, but it's not the totality of their life. But let me just end and say thank you so much for your time and attention engaging with this material. Thank you so much for Crescendo for this opportunity and invitation to come and share and participate. God bless you as you care for caregivers and as you lead your church and you support people and surround people with the love of Jesus Christ. God bless you.
Thanks so much to Scott for sharing so personally about a very important topic, showing us how churches can support those who are in these caregiving situations, and it's so many of us. Name a personal connection to caregiving. It might be you, it might be a family member, it might be a friend. And what support can you think of that the caregiver needs?